EST, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us from across the world. A warm welcome from the Science Eye team to all the esteemed panelists and participants of today's webinar on the topic of carbon sequestration project development on tribal lands. I'm Ankita Mitra, a PhD student in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue University. And my current research focuses on analyzing planted forests in the East Asian countries. In addition, I'm also a team member of the Science Eye organization, which leads to groundbreaking collaboration among the interdisciplinary scientific communities. Allow me to introduce my fellow members of the Science Eye team, Cain Abbasi and Wookjin Choi, who are also the PhD students in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. We also have with us Shinny Izo as one of the other supporting members of our Science Eye team, and glad to invite her as well because she's an undergrad student at Purdue University. And last but not the least, let me introduce Dr. Jingjing Liang, who is the Associate Professor of Quantitative Forest Ecology at Purdue University and the founder of this amazing platform, Science Eye. So today we are really excited to have all of you in today's webinar, and we do expect a power-packed 90-minute learning session, but it doesn't end today. This is a stepping stone towards greater collaboration among the participants of this webinar who are experts in their individual scientific research areas. And today is the first of the series of webinars being hosted by the Science Eye group. And more information about the upcoming webinars have been posted in the Science Eye website, as well as in the flyer sent to you in your respective emails by the Science Eye team. In addition, if either of you are interested in contributing to the white paper entitled Empower the Underrepresented in Forest Science, please do complete the survey form. My co-host Cain Abbasi will shortly provide the link of the survey in the chat box. And then finally, before we begin this session, a quick reminder. I'm sure many of you will have questions during these interesting presentations of today. So kindly make sure that you put all your questions together in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. So the Q&A box is specifically for the question and answers from the attendees or from any other members for the presentation. And the panelists will address those questions at the end of their presentations. And also, please feel free to reach out to either of the supporting members of Science Eye if you have any technical questions or doubts or any other confusions. We are here to help you as much as possible. And now, without taking much of your time, I would like to welcome Dr. Liang and Cain to provide further insights. So Dr. Liang and Cain, the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankita. Hi, everyone. I am Akane, one of Science Eye supporting team members. We like to start the session by taking the poll just for us to get a brief idea of what our audience is looking like. So I will start the poll, and I would appreciate if you can answer the short survey right now, taking 1 minute. Okay, you should be seeing the poll now. I will give 1 minute or so for you to answer. Okay, 70% of the participants have already answered. It's now 80%. I'll wait for maybe 10 more seconds. All right, so almost 90% of the participants have answered. Thank you so much. I will share the results now. So we have a very diverse audience today from almost all the continents except Oceania. That is very interesting. Good morning, good evening, or whatever that is for you. And affiliation, we have participants from governmental groups, individual, as well as NGOs, intergovernmental organizations. But the majority is from academia, it looks like. And we also have more male participants than females. So yeah, I hope that gives our panelists a good idea of how our audience is looking like today. Thank you very much, everyone, for sharing your survey answers. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Liang.
Thank you, Akane. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome for everyone to join us in this first seminar, the webinar series of Science Eye. And so today we are very glad to have Dr. Bryan Van Stippen and Dr. Cain to join us as guest speakers. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I would like to remind everyone that we have a short survey. So if you can enter your name and contact information in the survey, if you go to the chat window, you're going to see the survey link. So please enter the name and email information of yours so we can contact you and keep track of our white paper development with you after the seminar. So with that, I'd like to bring your attention to our guest speakers. And so today we are going to have both Dr. Bryan Van Stippen and Dr. Cain as our guest speakers. And Dr. Bryan Van Stippen is a program director for National Indian Carbon Coalition, an initiative of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation that provides education, training, and technical assistance to American Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages and corporations, Native Hawaiian organizations, and First Nations in Canada on the development of carbon credit and renewable energy projects on tribal land. A member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Dr. Van Stippen is previously served for 7 years as tribal attorney for the Ho-Chunk Nation Department of Justice in Wisconsin, where he was responsible for land acquisition and other land-related issues. So Dr. Bryan Van Stippen earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's in computer information system from Tarleton State University in Texas. And he is a graduate of the University of North Dakota School of Law, the University of Tulsa College of Law, and the University of Arizona College of Law. And then we have Dr. Cain. And Dr. Cain is a founder and CEO of the Sequestration Institute. And he has a long history of diversified clients, including multinational corporate consulting for circular economy, multiple think tank projects for the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group, conceptual design and project navigation for Sequestration Habitat for Humanity, Eco Village, and he is also the primary author of the first carbon negative climate action plan among the US college campuses and in many other projects. He is currently a senior program and policy strategist for the National Indian Carbon Coalition. And so with that, the floor is all yours, Bryan and Kali.
Great, thank you for that, Dr. Liang. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present to this group today for Science Eye, especially on some of the work that we've been doing with Indigenous populations in North America over the last few years. So After that very in-depth introduction, which I haven't heard in quite some time, I do want to say Seguli and Yako. I greet you and I thank you in my traditional language as a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. Our reservation lands lie within the exterior boundaries of the city limits of Green Bay. So we are just in northeastern Wisconsin here in the United States, with some major population centers in our region, in which I live just off the reservation lands. So as in the introduction, Dr. Liang had mentioned, I am an attorney by trade. I came into this position as the program director for the National Indian Carbon Coalition approximately 5 years ago in 2017. I had really no background in this industry besides taking some environmental law classes, and was kind of throwing feet first into the fire. 2017 was obviously right after the election season, in which a lot of federal policy was trending away from what climate change entailed and how to address those major issues. For the first 6 to 9 months, I struggled wholeheartedly in this position, and at one point in time told my boss that we might as well shut this whole thing down because people just were not interested. A lot of negative connotations as to what these types of projects entailed. And then all of a sudden, something just flipped. I went to visit Appalachian State University for a conference, ran into a couple other individuals that were struggling as well. And they said, you know, you got to keep your head up and keep plugging along because you can't give up. We need to get this type of work done, not only for Indigenous populations, but for the world in general. So it took that renewed faith and went forward again, and things just changed dramatically because the prior federal administration kept talking about climate change. More and more people started asking questions as to what this actually meant and how carbon sequestration projects could benefit their lands. So it was a little bit of a heavy lift in the beginning, and so we've come full circle on how we present a lot of our information, how we engage with these Indigenous communities, how we present our information to these tribal communities, because there's been a lot of negative information, a lot of misunderstanding of how these projects affect Indigenous lands. So we're now finally starting to pick up some steam. Been partnering with Dr. Kelly Cain here for the last 4.5 years. We met right off the bat on how to help message us. As I mentioned, you know, I did not have a background as an attorney coming into this. So working with Dr. Cain has helped me understand this industry and how to navigate within the areas that we think tribes can really help move this type of work forward. So with all that being said, on myself, I'm going to let Dr. Kelly Cain introduce himself, and then we're going to jump into who we are, what we do, and how we message and engage with Indigenous communities throughout North America.
Thanks, Bryan. Good morning, all. Afternoon and evening and joining us from around the world. That's terrific. Kelly Cain. I was professor in environmental science and management and land use planning at the University of Wisconsin for 28 years at the River Falls campus. And in the last 7 years of that tenure, I was director of campus sustainability, as well as co-founding director of the St. Croix Institute for Sustainable Community Development, which was a think and do tank on campus for faculty, staff, students, stakeholders from around the region, nation, and a fair amount of international work as well. I left there in 2014 and took St. Croix Institute into private consulting, doing corporate community institutional consulting. And then in 2016, rolled out LICO2E, L-I-C-O-2E, doing business as locally invested carbon offsets. So the idea of how do we monetize carbon offsets in local economies, just like we do food, energy, art, beer, whatever it might happen to be, because the degree, the economic impact of carbon offsets on a planetary basis that were not being sequestered, if I can use that word, in local economies was a great opportunity. So I rolled that out as a public benefit corporation, and not too long after that, mutual attorney friend of mine and Bryan's introduced us, and it's been a busy 4.5 years, and especially the last 2 years, feeling like we're strapped to a rocket, which is really good. There's much to be done. So with that, I would turn it back to Bryan.
Thank you for that introduction, Kelly. So again, the National Indian Carbon Coalition, we were created by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, as well as the Intertribal Agricultural Council. So those two nonprofit organizations have been working with Indigenous populations for a combined 50 years. A lot of history, a lot of good work being done by those organizations. And they came together to create the National Indian Carbon Coalition because at that point in time, approximately in 2011, a lot of tribal nations were getting approached by for-profit developers trying to get tribes to enter into the California cap and trade program, or what we call the compliance market. And there was a lot of issues with tribes participating in that marketplace. So my boss at the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and the other organization, the Intertribal Agricultural Council, said we need to create an entity to help educate tribes, move them along the path, and make determinations as to whether these projects are beneficial or what we like to say in the best interest of Indian country or that specific tribe. So we look at the carbon sequestration projects as economic development opportunities to protect and preserve tribal natural resources rather than extract or exploit. Over history, over time, a lot of natural resources have been removed from tribal lands because that's the easiest, quickest way to derive revenue for those tribal communities. And that's where we see a lot of the for-profit developers coming in and looking at how they might be able to exploit those natural resources for the benefit that do not necessarily go back into Indian country. So again, we want to protect and preserve land ownership, reduce climate change by conserving those natural resources, and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So historically, have been some of the biggest issues. We call it took and crook. Our lands have been stolen through fraud, theft, or through federal action. And so what we are trying to ensure is that we have beneficial opportunities for the tribes themselves to make the decisions over their land bases. A lot of times, especially specifically in the United States, as well as in Canada, the federal administrations or the governments make decisions for the Indigenous peoples on their lands. A lot of times, those Indigenous communities don't have a lot of say as to how certain actions are taken. We're seeing a big change in how lands are being managed in Indian country now. So it's been a great opportunity on seeing Indigenous communities being able to have these decision-making authorities over their natural resources. And of course, we want to make sure that they're healthy natural resources. There's a lot of issues with health issues in Indian country between diabetes and heart disease. A lot of times we relate that to the loss of our environment. So some of the benefits that we look, obviously, is going to be revenue generation. Can we derive some revenue by keeping these natural resources in the ground? And then what will we use that revenue for? Putting it back into our communities. Preservation of tribal land ownership, not only preservation of the land ownership, but also the acquisition, trying to acquire more lands. As I mentioned, my tribe, the Oneida Nation, we're a 65,000 acre reservation just outside of Green Bay with, again, portion of the city limits inside the reservation lands, but the tribe only owns a fraction of that land within their reservation. And a lot of it is owned by outside individuals that are non-tribal members. And so trying to reacquire lands within the exterior boundaries of their reservations is a big goal for my parent organization, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, as well as for the National Indian Carbon Coalition, promotion of land stewardship, and I should even say sustainable land management, putting in more sustainable management practices onto those lands to ensure that we are protecting and preserving those land bases, greenhouse gas emissions, and then, which Dr. Cain will talk about here in a little bit, promotion of soil health, ecological diversity, water and air quality, which we are calling our co-benefits that match and align with the development of carbon sequestration projects. So some of the things that we do at the National Indian Carbon Coalition, again, is to educate and work with tribal communities, leadership, staff, and membership to make sure that they understand what these projects entail, because they are complex. It takes a long time. The development process, if I were to get a tribal nation to say, as of today, right now, that we want to move forward with the development of a carbon project, it takes approximately 2 years to do so. So that's going to be an issue that we see in Indian country, is just the timeline of trying to make these decisions to get the projects up off the ground, because specifically in our tribal communities, we do have elected officials in which we have to campaign and run political processes. So you have to run for office, you have to get elected. And every tribe is different. There's 578 tribal nations in the United States. Every tribe has a different process on how they elect their leaders. In my tribe, it's every 4 years, and we have 11 tribal council members that then get reelected. And obviously, not every time will all of those people make it back into their position. So you're continually having to educate the leadership as to what these projects entail as people come and go in and out of office. So again, it just takes some time to work with leadership, staff, and membership. We have what we call general tribal councils, in which every member of the tribe has the right to vote at our general tribal council meetings. And we have the ability to pass resolutions to guide the direction of what our government and our elected officials move forward. So we want to ensure that not only is leadership informed as to what these projects entail, but membership, because they do have a large say in how these projects are developed and created. Obviously, we want to be unbiased and independent. We state that we are a trusted resource for Indian country. We want to make sure that as a nonprofit organization, that the information that we are providing to the tribe is, for one, owned by the tribe itself at the end of the day, and making sure that any information that is shared with us, that they retain that ownership, and then provide this information so that they can make informed decisions. We use web mapping and satellite imagery to develop these type of systems. Again, with the different areas of how tribes are on the technological spectrum, there's been all kinds of different analysis of land bases. So there's been some times when I've run into a tribe that has a Department of Transportation map, that they have a physical map of the borders of their land base just outlined in a red pencil. And then there's been some that we have very sophisticated GIS programs that can drill down and give us every single bit of information on that parcel throughout history. So our goal at the National Indian Carbon Coalition was try to make sure that we at least leveled the playing field with tribes and provided electronic mapping for tribal nations that did not have that GIS capability. And that was an issue that we ran into early on, and just something that we weren't expecting to engage with the tribal nation. And for those leaders and that staff to not have a great grasp as to what their land holdings actually were. So came out and rolled out a program. We are actually working with one of the largest tribal colleges and universities in the nation right now, Haskell out of Kansas. We're developing a GIS program for tribal students to learn more about web mapping, GIS systems, and develop a career path and get an education in that to bring them into Indian country, work for their respective tribes. Then that's part of the education and guidance that we're looking at. How do we engage with the youth? How do we engage with other organizations? Dr. Liang and I had met with an entity called Rising Voices a few weeks ago, which is a tribally based entity for Native American educators and students. So hopefully we develop that relationship a little bit here further as we move along in those conversations, because it's extremely important that tribal youth understand the opportunities that they have available to them as this type of work is being done in Indian country. And then finally, aggregation of carbon projects. This is a dream, I would say. It's very difficult to get multiple tribal nations to work together due to historical trauma with one another at points in time. So it's a little bit of a Hopefully it will work out in the future. Right now, it's been a heavy lift trying to get multiple tribes to work together with one project. So quickly, how do these projects work? As I mentioned earlier, it's approximately a 2-year process from once we get tribal council approval to move forward. So our first step is that we develop a carbon assessment feasibility study. I work with outside third-party developers to get this work done. They're trusted resources. We've vetted them. We've worked with them multiple times. They worked with some of these organizations had worked in Indian country previously, which is important to us so that they understand how to engage with the tribal community, with tribal leadership. So we develop a feasibility study to determine whether or not the project would actually be economically viable. When we look at forest-based lands, we state that there has to be a minimum of 3,000 acres in order to be able to do this. We specifically look at American Carbon Registry's Improved Forest Management Protocol. We do all the analysis on the front end to ensure that, again, that the project is going to be economically viable and a revenue generator for the tribe. So once we get into the approval process, after we get done with the feasibility, we go back to the tribal leadership. We make a recommendation. Obviously, the recommendation is usually to move forward, assuming that the project is economically viable. And that's when the heavy lift starts. So there's a lot of verification, certification that has to be completed. We have to hire a outside third-party forest inventory crew that is knowledgeable on tree inventory for carbon. There's not that many of them that we have run across in the United States. There's a couple, again, that I do trust and have bringing them and engaging with them on the majority of our projects. But it takes time. So they physically have to put boots on the ground. We go out into the woods, we measure the trees, do a bunch of different data collection, and then they go back into their office and have to clear the data and make it presentable to the developer. So we then start working with the carbon project developer. The developer is adhering to the protocol parameters. And again, I mentioned the ACR Improved Forest Management Protocol. So the developer is extremely well versed in that protocol and the needs on how we have to adhere to it. Some of the issues that we run across are just ensuring that we are creating additionality on our projects. And by developing additionality, we focus on creating extremely conservative baselines, taking the very minimal harvest requirements that tribal nation may be able to do. So we're starting to call it coulda versus woulda, like what would a tribal landowner do versus what could they do? Because we're starting to see a lot of buyers, excuse me, a lot of buyers are more interested in the, well, what would you actually do rather than what could you actually do? Because a lot of the original projects that were developed 5-10 years ago were just taking every single tree they could include in the project, even if that tree could never technically be harvested. So there's a lot of questioning going on right now in the industry, and we are trying to ensure that our projects are developing the high quality, high integrity carbon credits by utilizing these extremely conservative baselines. So once we get through that process with the forest inventory team and the developer, we then have to hire a third-party independent verification organization. And there's a whole slew of those types of organizations, but then they come back, go onto the lands, remeasure all of the trees in conjunction with the forest inventory team to make sure that, for one, the trees are actually there and that the measurements are within a certain parameter of allowances per the protocol. So we have to say, if this tree was measured at 50 feet high and 3 feet round, then the verifier goes in the woods and checks that tree, that specific tree that the inventory team did, to make sure that their measurements are accurate. And you have to have both the verifier and the forest inventory team there together to discuss any discrepancies. So far, we have not had any major issues with that, surprisingly, but I have heard some horror stories from some of the verifiers where they go into the woods and the measurements are extremely inaccurate and not even anywhere near what the forest inventory teams have done previously. So that finally leads us then to the next stage where we're looking at the verification and registry review. So after we go through the forest inventory, the developer data and development, and the third-party verification, we have to send all of that information to the registry itself. There are 3 registries that we have been focusing on: Vera, American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve. There's a couple other ones that we have not yet engaged with, Gold Standard, Red Plus, and I guess Plan Vivo we have worked with out of Scotland a little bit. But we have to send that information to the registry. They go through all of our data to make sure it's accurate, clear, and concise. And that, again, takes approximately another 6 to 9 months. And then at the end of that process, there are credit certification. So once the credits are certified, we can begin selling those credits on the open market. Some of the issues that we run into with Indigenous communities is that they want to have a lot of say over who acquires the carbon credits that are generated on their lands. So for instance, we are working with the Fond du Lac, Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa Indians outside of Duluth, Minnesota. And that tribe has said, we do not want to sell to any oil and gas or any organizations up and down that distribution chain. So it gets rid of any sort of pipeline organizations, any sort of refineries, and obviously any sort of oil generated or fossil fuel producers, which I'm totally comfortable with. It just, I then have to go out there and find organizations that adhere to the cultural values and environmental values of that tribe, which makes it a little bit of a heavier lift. So far, there's been a strong interest in the credits we've developed on that project. We are in the process of currently selling them. We wanted to make some announcements yesterday for Indigenous Peoples Day, but ran out of time with some of the buyers of those credits that we had sold to, just through having to go through the legal process with each one of those entities to review all of the contracts and all of the legal terms for the acquisition of these credits. So again, that takes time for that process to occur. And then what we have is the monitoring, reporting, and verification of the project over the duration. We specifically focus on the voluntary carbon market, which is a 40-year duration. As I had mentioned early on, one of the reasons why the National Indian Carbon Coalition was created was because tribes were enrolling projects in the California cap and trade market, which was a 100-year duration. And then some tribes just had some issues and concerns with the duration of those projects. So we started focusing on the voluntary marketplace, which allowed us to enter projects with a 40-year process. So what do we need when we develop our feasibility study? We need the inventory data, the forest management plan, growth and yield data, and the mapping of the targeted lands. So again, it's just getting this information from the tribe itself. There is some publicly available information in which we can gather this data, but mapping of the targeted lands is the hard part. So the tribe, again, with example for Fond du Lac, they have 44,000 acres of forested lands. After going through with what we call the carbon committee, or our carbon sequestration project development committee, for the long name, we ended up deciding that 8,200 acres made the most sense for that tribal nation. They did not feel comfortable enrolling all of their lands into a project, which again, I'm totally fine with. I want the tribe to be comfortable as to how they are developing their projects, because they are the ultimate decision makers in this process. So having to go through all of that community meetings and work group meetings, and then presenting to leadership on what we felt made the most sense for that tribe. And so that's part of the process that we have to go through to ensure that, again, staff, leadership, and membership are comfortable on moving forward. So what do we get out of here? We get the natural resource density. As I mentioned, we have to go in and physically measure all of the land base with a forest inventory crew within that defined project boundary. And what do we get out of that? We get the reduction rates and the minimum acres that we can develop on that with that land base. So as I mentioned a couple of times, we have worked with tribal nations and indigenous communities from Hawaii to Alaska. We're doing our first outreach with First Nations in Canada. And we have run into many, many issues as to why Indigenous communities will not enroll in these types of programs. So after a few years of not making very much progress, as Kelly had mentioned earlier, the last 2 years have been like a rocket ship. Prior to that, it was trying to redefine our messaging, trying to figure out where the hiccups were for tribes that were trying to enroll in these projects, what their questions and concerns were, and why they were not entering into projects. Again, there was a lot of for-profit developers out there that were pressuring tribes to enroll every single acre of land that they could into a project, and it just rubbed tribes the wrong way. Rather than trying to even figure out if something would work, the conversations just turned into, we don't want to do anything at all. We're not going to engage. We're not going to discuss this. Just leave us alone. We don't want to have a conversation as to whether or not these might even be beneficial for our lands. So we engaged with the Nature Conservancy just before the pandemic hit at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020, to try to help develop the Tribal Land Conservation Initiative, is what we call it. And this is where we focus on specific benefits for the tribes that we thought addressed a lot of their concerns and made the most sense. So the National Indian Carbon Coalition, we act as the project proponent only on the voluntary carbon market space. And that is because of the 40-year duration. So again, voluntary marketplace, it's 40 years for the project. On the compliance market space, or the California Cap and Trade program, it's a 100-year duration. And some tribes just were not comfortable with that. Again, elected officials have 4-year terms. At the most, a lot of times it's between 2 and 3 years. So the elected officials were just not comfortable enrolling their tribal lands in a project that could take up to 100 years if they were only going to be in office for a 2-year time frame or a 4-year time frame. So there was a lot of concern over that duration, in which why we started focusing on the 40-year opportunity under the voluntary market. The National Indian Carbon Coalition covers the upfront costs for all those third-party developers. Again, I said it was a 2-year process. There's a cost over that duration to develop the project. It usually runs a couple $100,000 and more depending upon the size of the project. So we are raising dollars so that we can cover those costs. Once carbon credit sales occur, then those funds are reimbursed back to the National Indian Carbon Coalition so we can do the next project. But we also need some of those funds to help with long-term management. So we contract with the tribes for that entire 40-year duration so that we're always there with them as staff changes, as leadership changes, that we at least have a background and understanding as to why the decisions were made to develop these projects in the first place, and to help the next staff members, the next leaders understand the benefits of these projects. So we wanted to be there for that entire 40-year duration. Now, I personally won't be there for that 40 years, but I'm hoping that my predecessors and our staff after will be able to help those tribal nations manage those projects for the long term. We do all the contracting with the third-party consultants. As I, again, mentioned, as a tribal attorney, that was one of the roles I did when I was in-house counsel, did all of the contract review and negotiations. And that just takes a lot of the workload off of the other attorneys that are involved in this process, specifically that are engaged by the tribes, and then gets the decision-making process away from tribal council, because for the most part, if you need to have a contract approved, it has to go through the executive branch within the tribal nation, and it just takes time. So to consolidate that workload and to consolidate those timelines, because we've already, as I mentioned, been working on these projects for multiple years, we want to try to move it along as quickly as possible. Now, credits will not be sold for less than $10 a credit on the voluntary market. We put that in there as a minimum to make it a conservative number. Right now, I'm getting $15 to $18 a credit for the projects that we are currently selling credits for on the open market space. We expect that value to rise over time. So we just use $10 as a placeholder to keep expectations low for the tribe, but internally, we believe that we can generate at least 15 a credit, if not more, as we move forward here. And then the big one is that the tribes have some say as to who purchases the credits. So again, I would walk in to engage with the tribal nation, say, I have these buyers lined up. I get calls from Shell and Exxon and BP and TransCanada and Enbridge all the time. And I can go to the tribal nation and leadership and say, hey, these guys are interested. Do you want me to sell your credits to them? And, 99% of the time it's been a no. So then I have to go out and try to find other buyers for the credits that we can call socially responsible organizations like the Amazons, Microsofts, Disneys of the world that we engage with to see if they'd be interested in purchasing these credits. Right now, I want to say we have our three of our projects in front of Meta, Bank of America, and Canada Post are three of the big organizations that are currently vetting our projects. And then getting into a couple of projects that, as I mentioned, we do have to market: Fond du Lac, Band du Lac, Superior, Chippewa. These revenue numbers are extremely low right now because we did price point that at the $10 a credit. We're going to generate approximately 437 credits over 10 years on the 8,200 acres. This project came to market in June of 2022. So we began the development in May of 2019, and it took a little bit longer just through the pandemic to get this project to the marketplace. We also are working with the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. They are located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This is on 16,500 acres. We're going to generate a few more credits than we were at Fond du Lac, which again is going to be a little bit higher of a price point. I think we are now at around 13 million in revenue to be generated for Keweenaw Bay as we move forward here. Again, due to the price points of the credits. And then our last one that we mentioned in this presentation is with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. Obviously, they're in the state of Mississippi in the United States. This is going to be on 26,000 acres, and we're looking at generating around $24 to $26 million in revenue for the tribe. So we have entered and engaged with a handful of more tribal nations, Native Hawaiian organizations, Alaska Native Villages and corporations. And again, as I mentioned, we're starting to do our outreach to First Nations in Canada. As we engage with these tribal communities, we have to make a determination as to what type of natural resource base each tribe has, because not all tribes have these large forest-based lands to develop these types of projects. So what we're trying to do at the National Indian Carbon Coalition is look at what the natural resources that specific Indigenous community has possession or of an ownership over that land base and develop a project around there. So that could mean that we're looking at grassland-based projects, or that we're looking at row crop type projects or grazing or pasture land type projects. So currently we're rolling out new protocols, new programs, new initiatives, looking at different opportunities dependent upon what the tribal natural resource base is, not just specifically focusing on forest-based projects. Just in the industry itself, there's some concerns over forest-based lands due to the natural forest fires that are occurring, especially in the northwestern part of the United States. So there's been some emphasis on developing grassland-based projects, because if there is a natural disaster, a lot of that carbon is still sequestered into the ground. Those grass roots remain and then regenerate. So it helps get the carbon out of the air or into the ground a little bit faster compared to a forest fire that could decimate entire regions and entire projects, which we have seen occur with a few tribal nations in the northwest part of the United States. So there's a lot of different movement, a lot of different opportunities that we are seeing for Indigenous populations in North America, how they develop these projects. We've been fortunate enough at the National Indian Carbon Coalition to receive a few federal grants from the United States Department of Agriculture. Currently, we have 2 grants that we are operating under. One, to develop a co-benefits tool as to what these projects actually help with other areas as the soil, air, and water quality. And then we do have a second USDA grant in which we are looking more at soil-based carbon projects. How do we implement more sustainable management practices into agricultural lands in Indian country, looking specifically at row crop and grazing lands. In the United States right now, there's a big push by tribal communities to reintroduce bison onto their lands. So we're starting to see a lot of tribes grazing more bison, getting bison herds established. And in doing so, the intent would be to develop a carbon project on those grazing lands in which where the bison are located to help derive an additional revenue stream. So we see multiple different opportunities with some of the grant funding that we've received. How do we engage with tribal nations? How do we help protect and preserve those natural resources by placing sustainable management practices onto those land bases, and then going through the process to derive revenue from those practices and ensuring that the revenue that is being generated goes back into the community to develop other renewable energy projects, do energy efficiency projects, weatherization of homes, acquisition of land, whatever opportunity that we can think of to truly address climate change. Because as I have had a tribal elder and leader tell me in the past, we see climate change affecting our tribal lands on a daily basis. We don't have the ability to simply pick up our lands and move them to a different area of the country. No, this is where our homes are. This is where we've lived for generations. We have to be able to adapt to climate change, and we need to be able to start doing it now. And we need to start utilizing the tools in the toolkit that are there for us. And that includes the development and placement of carbon sequestration projects on their lands. So, we're a nonprofit organization. I don't have a big skin in the game, except that we're trying to ensure that we're addressing climate change. But for the revenue generation aspect of it, my goal is to ensure that the majority of those revenues go back into the Indigenous community's hands so that they can utilize it for the benefit of their community, and ensuring that the third-party verifiers, developers, forest inventory crews that we work with understand and have the ability and capability to work with tribal nations, because it's not always easy. And I want to make sure that those organizations have the best interest of Indian country at heart at the end of the day. So that's a short version of who we are at the National Indian Carbon Coalition, some of the work that we're doing with Indigenous communities in North America. Most recently, I was a team of one, along with Kelly as a consultant. And now we do have a new staff member on board, Susan Wakan, who I had worked with when I was with the Ho-Chunk Nation as of 2 weeks ago. So Susan's on the call today, learning a lot of things that you guys are hearing about, because we have not yet had a chance to meet in person since she got brought on board. So it's been fast and furious, as Kelly mentioned, trying to figure all this out as we move along. Not only are we looking at the development of these projects, but setting policy, not only at the state or federal level, but at the United Nations level. We participate in some of the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative through the Expert Advisory Group, where we participate in some other workforce and task forces that are developing policy at a worldwide level, especially with our engagement with the Nature Conservancy and other large for-profit organizations. My statement is I believe that Indigenous communities can be a leader in this industry because specifically in the United States and Canada, we have ownership of our lands, and we have large swaths of territories and natural resources that we can protect by developing these projects and push other landowners in our regions to move forward with us as well. So with all that being said, I appreciate your guys' time today. I'm going to pass it over to Kelly to talk specifically about our co-benefits tool, how we are developing this tool, which would be, we believe, one of the first to analyze this type of data, and figuring out how we might be able to develop yet an additional revenue stream by creating a co-benefits tool. So Kelly, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. As Bryan reinforced, we're working at as fast a pace as we can go with extremely complex sorts of projects, and that complexity from a carbon sequestration standpoint is only part of that. The complexity really begins to grow when we think about what the co-benefit opportunities and really necessities are around those carbon projects. So we think about it from a Paris Accord standpoint. Basically, 2030 is tomorrow. We are out of time. As we think about how slowly organizations at every level evolve in order to meet this challenge. We are working on a sense of urgency and at the same time against the complexity of the project. So one of the grants that Bryan mentioned with the USDA, we received in 2020 to create a web-based tool for co-benefit metrics and valuation, with the idea that we would ultimately be able to take that co-benefit model, turn it into a protocol, and be able to commoditize that in the voluntary market. So not only would there be carbon revenue, but there could be revenue based on the co-benefits, which we typically, when you think about it in a hierarchical sense, think of it in terms of ecosystem services. So water, biodiversity, air quality, it's soil health, etc. But we also talk about it in terms of the socio-cultural services that are then derived, and from a tribal perspective, are part and parcel to tribal spiritual fulfillment. And as we think about how the world is recognizing the carbon dilemma that we are now in, there is also the recognition, and you find it in the literature and presentations across the world, we have to solve biodiversity walking hand in hand with those carbon projects. So what we are doing is to take the United Nations Global Compact for Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 SDGs, as they are oftentimes referred to, and rewriting the sub-metrics for each of those goals from a North American tribal perspective. When you look at those SDGs, they are written in a very qualitative, subjective sort of way, predominantly, and they are, and with all good intent, I mean, they're written from an international perspective, and we recognize that from a North American tribal perspective, we would like to get far more specific in terms of the impact on North American tribes. So in rewriting the metrics for those SDGs and putting real numbers around benchmarking of what happens to water, both surface and subsurface, what happens to biodiversity, both land and water-based, what happens to air quality, what happens to soil health, and then being able to quantify those and eventually put, which is where we are now, beginning to put economic values around those benchmark metrics that can literally enhance the price that we are able to get for the carbon credits. So the idea that a corporation wants to buy those credits and we can present them with hard data around the ecosystem and social context of that project, which then rolls almost seamlessly, that's easier said than done, almost seamlessly into their SDG or GRI, Global Reporting Initiative metrics, that they're reporting in sustainability impact reports on an annual basis, that sort of thing. So we spent the first 15 months of that grant looking under every rock, so to speak, to find any existing model that we could build upon rather than recreating the wheel, so to speak. And through our connections at Arbor Day, who had done some initial work in this area, but had not taken this to where we were wanting to go, we were put in contact with a contractual vendor for our GIS model that we are now, in the past 3 months, we are now at the point of getting ready to provide a beta review of those for major stakeholders. In this initial model, which we're calling the tier 1 data, so it is data that is that's not always readily public available, but it's publicly available data that the tribes would not find of concern from their own confidentiality and sovereignty perspectives. Putting together the initial tier 1 model, and then are now in active, we've already been through negotiations, but getting ready now to provide this initial tier 1 model to the National Renewable Energy Lab, commonly referred to as NREL, in Colorado, where there is in existence what is known as a tribal energy atlas. So if you go out and dig up tribal energy atlas under NREL, you'll see that there is already a very strong database around the energy potential that tribes have around the country. And we are getting ready to now integrate the carbon and a wide variety of the co-benefits into that model over the next several months, which we think will be available for some public review in the first quarter of this next year. So it's not just the ecosystem services, but from a social cultural perspective, it is what ultimately happens, not just to the water, biodiversity, air, soil, but then what happens from a socio-cultural perspective on behalf of the tribe. So we look at it, one of the easiest ways, or one of the most important ways, is from a subsistence hunting, fishing, gathering perspective. Because as Bryan referenced, traditional diet is extremely critical to individual and community health in those tribal communities. And so what happens to subsistence hunting, fishing, gathering as far as populations of critical species, both land and water, as well as plant, medicinal, and otherwise, that then reinforces traditional diet, which reinforces individual and community health, which impacts community health economics in terms of delivery of health services. So all of that is being put into SDGs, as we have talked about. And then we're also using the SDG model as a way, as Bryan talked about, there are some corporate buyers who we want to make sure that when Bryan takes those to a tribal governing board, that we can literally demonstrate that they are not only committed to science-based targets and committed to SDGs and or GRI, which is heavily mapped to that, but they actually have evidence of high performance in that regard, so that it's not just fluff, so to speak. Then we're creating a tier 2 model, which will be privy only through the National Indian Carbon Coalition, that will be used specifically with those tribes, but starts to bring in data around each of the tribal reservations who wish to participate that would not be available in the public realm, but that are critical to the kinds of decisions that the tribe needs to make in this regard. So that would be the short story on that one. And I'm sorry, we don't have any slides of that project yet. We are keeping that until we're ready to roll that out on a public basis. There's no doubt we know that there are others in the market around the world who are pursuing co-benefit metric development and recognize the potential value of that being brought into the marketplace. So we're keeping it under wraps until we're ready to roll it out on a public basis.
And so thank you for that, Kelly. It's been extremely interesting going through that process. of development of that co-benefits tool, we're starting to see more action in this space again with the creation of new marketplaces. Kelly and I work closely with an organization called B Carbon that was developed out of Rice University in Texas. We just seen at Climate Week a few weeks ago, Salesforce came out with their own marketplace. So we're starting to see a lot of different activity, a lot of different organizations trying to find their role in the carbon world. One of the other things that are starting to come to fruition are the consolidation of many of these different partners. We're seeing developers being acquired by organizations that are looking at development of carbon projects for their own benefit. We're seeing large private equity firms buying brokers and developers to join into one big team. And so we're just trying to figure out in our area what makes the most sense, who to partner with, where things are going to be trending. I think a few months ago, there was an article that stated currently in the voluntary carbon market space that the value of the entire market is between $20 and $30 million, and they're projecting this to be a $30 billion industry by 2030. So there's just so much interest in what's occurring in this arena, not only in North America, but worldwide. And then getting indigenous communities, again, worldwide, engaged into these marketplaces, because in a lot of different spots in the world, looking at Australia with the Aborigines, or New Zealand with the Maori, and a lot of work done in South Africa and South America, there's engagement with indigenous communities, but then not a lot of that revenue that's being developed out of these projects go into that tribal or indigenous community. I know there's a project right now that is getting beat up a little bit by one of the developers because the original credits sold for around $4 a credit. Well, now the credits are worth, again, 15 to 18 a credit. So that indigenous community is saying, well, where's our money? Because you only gave us $4 a credit when it was developed 5 years ago, and now it's worth X amount of dollars. And that's one of the things that we're trying to ensure that we engage with an indigenous community, is that we have those conversations on the front end of this is how these projects work. And again, one of the reasons why I like the voluntary market space, not only do that 40-year duration, but there are also some other benefits, specifically that you sell your carbon credits on an annual basis. So every year credits are being developed for that project. And then every year I can go out and find a buyer for those credits as the values of those carbon credits increase over time. So we believe that this is a long-term strategy for tribes, again, to protect and preserve their natural resources, but also to derive revenue from those resources to do other types of projects. We think and believe strongly that the co-benefits is going to be a big opportunity for tribal communities, because there are marketplaces that are starting to come online at looking at selling the co-benefits themselves or co-mingling them with the carbon credits to derive an additional value. Kelly had mentioned LICO 2E. We have since created TICO 2E, tribal invested carbon offsets. So with the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa project, it's based in the state of Minnesota. We're looking for buyers in that region of those carbon credits. So for one of the buyers is the University of Minnesota itself that's supporting that project. But we want to engage with organizations in those regional areas within that state to help support these projects, because we all know that if you keep a dollar within that tribal community, it's going to recirculate through that entire region more often than trying to support a project overseas or in the global south. So there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of different spaces that you can work in right now to try to see what makes the most sense for the communities that you guys are engaged with. But it's ensuring that what we talk about is walking hand in hand with one another. We see so many organizations walking on the same road, but nobody's working together. And that's what we're trying to develop, is those close relationships with these other outside organizations like the Nature Conservancy, Arbor Day Foundation, American Forest Foundation. We're part of the 1T.org stakeholder council now. They're starting to develop a Central American branch of 1T.org. So there's a lot of opportunities that we see worldwide to engage with and participate in these types of conversations, because we need everybody on board to figure out how to address these issues. I don't necessarily want to say that carbon sequestration is the solution, but it is one of the tools in the toolkit, and we have to be able to utilize it to the best of our advantage right now so that we can get Indigenous communities to participate and have more of these types of conversations. We don't see climate coordinators or sustainable climate managers within Indigenous communities currently. That's going to be an area that we feel that there's going to be a big need here in the coming years to help tribes understand how climate change is affecting their land base and how to better plan for it in the future. So again, that's some of the short story of the things that Kelly and Susan and I have now been working on over the last few years. It's just been remarkable, from, again, the original wanting to shut this whole thing down after 6 or 9 months because I just kept getting yelled at by everybody, to where we are now, where we're engaging with, again, organizations like the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, Ecosystem Market Service Place Consortium, Bipartisan Policy Center, Arbor Day, Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund. I mean, it's been amazing to see where we've come. And then now we're trying to build out this aspect of it, what Dr. Liang on the educational side and the data collection, because this is all a need to make these projects successful. And engaging the underserved populations, the Native American youth, the Indigenous community youth, to lead in the very near future here, after all you guys go through your programs and start working in this industry. I mean, this is where it's trending, and this is the direction that we've seen it go. I've only been doing this for 5 years. Kelly can tell you he did it for 28 years at a university, being a former professor himself, to see how far we've come along in the last few years that we've been working together. So I appreciate all your time. Yako is thank you in my traditional language. We're here for any questions. You can take our email and telephone information if you want to follow up one-on-one afterwards. Good. We're here to figure out how to solve these issues together.
Great. Thank you very much, Drs. Van Stippen and Cain. So we're moving on to Q&A session. So if you have questions, I already got 3 questions in Q&A button. So if you click on Q&A button, you can post your questions there. Or if you prefer to speak yourself, you can raise hand and we can enable your speaker. So before Q&A session, actually, let me quickly remind you that if you like to join our white paper out of these webinars, please click on the survey link in the chat. Somehow, if you don't see the chat message in the chat box, let me quickly share my screen and share my email address. It's aota@purdue.edu. So this is the message I sent in the chat box. If you don't see it, you can send me a message, email, and I can send you the link. So yeah, we would appreciate if you can do that. And let's move on to Q&A. So the first question we got to Bryan, how do you ensure preliminary funding for the first steps of the project in advance? Is it external or somehow a part of the tribal budget assignment?
Well, originally, I made a bunch of promises that I made my boss keep, because I said, I can't get these projects up off the ground unless we tell the tribes that we can cover the expenses. So we found some dollars to be able to do this, and then started fundraising off on the back end. So far, we received, we're trying to create a $5 million revolving fund, and I think I am at about $2.4 million that we've raised over the last 18 months. There's been a lot of strong interest in this. The beauty of it, though, is that it's a revolving fund. So if a project costs $300,000 to $350,000 for me to get up off the ground, and once we start selling the credits, that funding goes back into that revolving fund to build on the next project. And we use some investment techniques to be able to have that money working for us as it's sitting in those accounts. So it was concerning for the first few years because I asked my boss if we could cover a couple $100,000 in expenses, and he's like, if this is what you need to get a project done, then just do it and we'll figure it out as we go along. That's one of the beauties about working for a small nonprofit that has the opportunity to be flexible. And so it's been fast and furious, and we're getting the job done. But sometimes it's been a little bit concerning as to where the dollars are going to come from. And now I'm finally at the stage where we can support 12 to 15 projects at any one point in time.
Thank you. And the next question we've been getting a lot of questions. From another anonymous attendee, do you see currently a momentum that could lead to further collaboration between tribes for intertribal big projects?
Again, it's a large goal. Aggregated projects are very difficult to get tribal communities to work together. And that's it's just due to the history of tribes, tribal partners. Even in the state of Wisconsin, there's 11 tribal nations within our state, but we're all from different backgrounds. So my tribe, the Oneida Nation, we originated in New York State, and then we relocated to Canada, and then finally in the Green Bay, Wisconsin area, in which a different tribe gave us our land base that was original from this area. And so sometimes we have those conflicts with one another just because we are not truly on our traditional lands. Our lands were given to us by another tribe, and you have those conflicts at point in time. However, for the greater good, those conversations are being had. What we would like to see eventually is large land-based projects working together with some of these smaller land-based tribes because they don't have the capacity to do so, especially what we see in California, in Washington State, and Oregon. So specifically the Northwest is getting a handful of these smaller land-based tribes to partner with a big tribe that has a large land holding so that everybody can participate in the marketplace and derive some revenue. So I think it's coming. It just takes time, as always. One of my big statements when we're talking with tribal nations is that we've been here for time immemorial. We're going to be here for time immemorial. However, when we talk to Kelly, his statement is, 2030 is right around the corner. We don't have time to wait. So we have to balance that conundrum when we're developing these projects.
Thank you. The next question is for Kelly. So how will you deal with possible conflicts between different SDG interests that are difficult to monetize with, for example, the more clearly monetary of some of these carbon project offsets?
Yeah, I think I understand what they're trying to get at. I mean, the value of the carbon is whatever the market will bear from a capitalistic standpoint in the voluntary carbon market, or the co-benefits, as I think this is getting at, are they run from easy to monetize to very difficult to monetize. So, for example, if we're talking about the impact of a forest carbon project or a grassland carbon project on water, both surface and subsurface, one reference point, and it's just one, and that's what we're now doing, is sifting through what are the most critical metrics and what are the valuations that we can apply to this based upon defensible existing markets and or totally new processes. So for example, around water, if you're familiar with the Bonneville Environmental Foundation, who has been trading water credits for some time now. Those credits trade at $4 per water credit. And a water credit is basically a savings or an impact of 1,000 gallons. So it's a matter of us being able to field measure and verify that what's the impact on surface and subsurface water quantities. Quality is a whole nother topic that we could use as a reference, or we could use the BFE water credit as a credit for per 1,000 gallons. Here's the positive impact that forest is having, and at $4 a credit, if we're adding 100,000 gallons to subsurface water as a result of that, here's what that would be worth in the marketplace. From a biodiversity standpoint, it gets more difficult. So as we think, it comes down to here in the upper Midwest, the primary fish species of interest for many of the tribes is walleye. So the question becomes, what is a walleye worth? Well, depending on who you ask, it has very different connotations. In the grocery store, here's the per pound value that you would have to pay for a walleye. From a tribal perspective, it goes way beyond just 16 ounces of walleye fillet that you have for availability, because it is so socially, culturally, and spiritually attached to the tribe's well-being. When we look at that, and one of the areas that I'm spending a lot of time in right now is, so if we're able to regain on the benefit of subsistence hunting, fishing, gathering, that the traditional diet within a particular community dramatically is able to improve, and the health of the community is able to improve. There are ways to back into those numbers based upon how much money is the tribe currently having to spend, or individual tribal members having to spend in terms of healthcare as a result of not having had benefit of traditional diet, to suddenly that traditional diet improving their health circumstances, which we can back into from an economic standpoint. So I'm not sure that I'm exactly answering the question as it's intended, but that's where I would start.
Thank you. Next question is for Bryan. It's coming from Lucio. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering if you know or contribute to the local communities and indigenous peoples platform run under the UNFCCC, and she's putting the link here.
I think we are a part of that. I'm pretty sure that we have provided information and responded to some of the calls out in that platform.
That's very nice.
We had a meeting a few months ago, but again, with pandemic, everything kind of gets jumbled up in Zoom calls on a daily basis. But it's been fast and furious, making relationships with a lot of different indigenous organizations throughout the world over the last 9 to 12 months.
Thank you. That's very exciting. The next question from A. Mitra. Can you clarify the third-party verification in context to carbon sequestration after the ground zero monitoring, whom to address?
I guess I can take the first part of that question. So for the third-party verification, in the development of specifically when we're looking at improved forest management projects through the American Carbon Registry, that third-party verifier, and we use Ruby Canyon. That's who we've used for our first handful of projects. They're an organization based out of California. And so they are an integral part of the process. They analyze all of our data that the developer and the forest inventory team have developed to ensure that we are adhering to the protocol requirements under the registry. So there is going to be discrepancies. And the good thing is that our forest inventory team is especially knowledgeable in carbon credit creation on their forest inventory. So we have not seen big discrepancies between the data developed between the forest inventory crew and the third-party verifier. So my first experience was I went into the woods with these teams, and it was amazing because the forest inventory guy goes out there and they pick random plots, and he says, "Okay, these are the 15 trees that we measured on this plot." And the third-party verifier team comes in and says, "All right, well, I'm going to measure all these trees again, and they better be within this allowance." And it was like 0.3% of what the height, width, diameter of that tree would be. And they had to, as boots on the ground, they had to go through the information right there and figure out if there was any discrepancies. And for the most part, our forest inventory team data was accepted by the third-party verifier. Again, there's an expense to that. It takes time, but in order to ensure that we are developing these high-quality, high-integrity carbon credits that the registry is going to approve and certify, we want to make sure that we're putting this data and this information together to ensure that the marketplace is going to be viable, because that's some of the issues that we've seen over time with the original projects generated 10, 15 years ago by organizations like the Nature Conservancy are getting beat up now because of how the process was developed back at that point in time. And it's ever changing and ever evolving. And what we're trying to do is utilize the most stringent standards that we can come up with internally with our organization and with our developer, because we don't want to be scrutinized 5, 10 years from now. So it's a complex, long-term process with many different factors that are taken into consideration as we develop these projects, because the buyers are looking for high integrity, high quality projects. You're not going to get an organization like Amazon to buy credits from you if you're just having willy-nilly data being developed that are the minimum standards set by the registries.
Thank you.
I would chime in just really quickly. I mean, we're seeing the race between the very stringent field data collection that Bryan's talking about, that is in parallel with technological development around AI, remote sensing, et cetera, in order to cut costs and be faster and limit the amount of in-field complexity. But when, as Bryan's pointing out, when Bloomberg News or Wall Street Journal comes out with major criticisms of projects calling in to question their integrity, that's what is really driving us. And B Carbon is also the newest nonprofit registry in the market that Bryan referenced, is basing its future very strongly on strong field data collection in order to calibrate those remote technologies.
Thank you both. Next question from Weigo Liu. Is that a good idea to use the sequestered carbon biomass as bioenergy?
I guess I would say it's dependent upon the area of the country that you're located, or the world, because in the northern United States, we have a lot of tribes that are operating on propane. And to get off of propane, we would recommend using a woody biomass fuel source. So woody pellet creation, installation of woody biomass boiler systems. We do have some tribes in northern Minnesota that have implemented those systems to help heat their tribal administration buildings, their tribal health buildings, their police departments, and their health facilities. So tribes, for the most part, have a large footprint within their community on buildings and utility usage, and we want to make sure that we're trying to utilize as few fossil resources as we need to. So transitioning to a woody biomass boiler system has been done often. Obviously, we want to look at other types of fuel sources as well, solar, wind, geothermal. Tribes are exploring all those opportunities. We have another initiative we're trying to get up off the ground, which we're developing tribal resiliency hubs, utilizing multiple different microgrid systems and energy development sources so that tribes become energy independent and energy self-sufficient. As we see climate change, natural disasters affect communities, we want to make sure that we are resilient, and goes all the way back to kind of Kelly's thing for a question earlier. Food distribution systems are a concern in Indian country because a lot of tribal nations are in rural areas. We rely upon a lot of processed foods, and we want to make sure that we have those healthy organic products in our tribal communities. So there's a lot of different avenues that we can utilize this revenue that's being generated from the carbon projects, looking at resiliency hubs, looking at food distribution systems, food sovereignty, energy independence, energy self-sufficiency. I mean, there's a whole gamut of opportunities that tribal nations can participate in to better be prepared for climate change, but also to help their tribal communities.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question from Mojo. It's a little bit long. Let me read it. There has been a lot of skepticism, criticism regarding carbon offset. One major concern is that carbon credits divert resources from long-term climate actions. The other is that the supposedly captured carbon is not actually captured. How does your coalition deal with these issues? Namely, does the coalition reinvest the profits from carbon credits back into climate adaptive forest management? If yes, how much? And secondly, how does the coalition ensure that the carbon off is not just greenwash, the carbon is actually captured? Which she says you previously answered the second question. So if you can address the first question, it would be great.
And that's a very complex question with a lot of different moving pieces and parts in there, because obviously we've been talking about additionality. We've been talking about developing high quality, high integrity carbon credits by adhering to the most stringent standards. Now, that's a question that we engage with tribal leadership, staff, and membership all the time, to make sure, again, that these projects are in the best interest of the tribes in analyzing the data that makes the most sense. Again, like with Fond du Lac, 44,000 acres of forested lands. The for-profit developers are like, you need to enter every single acre of forested lands in the project because we want them to make money. This is what the for-profit developers are trying to do. And I can come behind and be, hey, let's figure out what makes the most sense for you guys, which is why we settled on 8,200 acres of forested lands so that the tribe is comfortable in enrolling and developing these projects in which they see makes the most sense for them. The interesting part for me with Fond du Lac was that wild rice is a very integral part of cultural food diets in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. And so by being able to develop a carbon sequestration project on forested lands around their wild rice bed lakes helps protect that natural resource and that cultural resource for the tribe. Even this past year, the wild rice harvest was considered to be poor because of climate change. There was not as much rice that was normally generated in past years. And we truly believe that heating of the water temperatures are rising. It is producing lower yield on those crops. So we have to figure out how to protect that land. And by keeping our trees close to the water's edge to provide shade is hopefully going to help with lowering the temperature of that lake on that, the water on that lake over time. So there's multiple, again, different factors, different considerations to be taken into play when we're trying to develop these projects. And then again, on the back end, avoiding that greenwashing statement. That's the last thing that we want to be scrutinized in the media, from Bloomberg to The Guardian to what we just saw with the Wall Street Journal. I know Arbor Day Foundation was just dinged for a project that they created about 8 years ago, using Red Plus. I mean, and I think the buyer of those credits was Disney. So, I mean, there's a lot of organizations that are getting raked through the mud right now. And this is the gamut that we run when there's these higher of a dollar amounts being developed in an industry that's up and coming. Like I mentioned, 25 million last year to 30 billion in 8 years. I mean, there's going to be a lot of different players that are in this industry that do not have the best of intentions to actually address climate change. So we're trying to ensure that the projects that we are developing with the tribes that we engage with are adhering to the most stringent, highest standards so that we can go out and talk to those organizations and say, work with us. We're developing these projects that will not be greenwashing, that will address true additionality. And yeah, we want a higher price point for our credits because we're benefiting an Indigenous community in your region. So it's a heavy lift. There's a lot of things that are going on trying to figure out what makes the most sense. Again, as an attorney, my statement has been, we develop a law, we create a law, and then we amend the law to make sure that it works efficiently and effectively. We have not necessarily seen that in the carbon world, where we implemented policy. The policy has not truly changed that much over time. And we're going through that process currently, which I do believe that Indigenous populations can be a leader in that policy change. So long answer to that question, because there's a lot to unpack there, but we appreciate your guys' time, and feel free to reach out and ask any questions that you want to, and we'll try to respond accordingly, because it's an interesting topic. We're excited to be in this workspace, but there's a lot of movement afoot and a lot of change occurring.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions, but unfortunately it's about the time. It has been a very nice talk. Any unanswered questions, I recommend you reach out to Drs. Van Stippen and Cain. If you have burning questions, I think they shared their contact information already. So thank you very much for joining. And I would like to remind that we have the survey in the chat. And so if you're interested in the white paper, please fill in that survey. And I will hand it over to Dr. Liang for a closing remark.
Thanks, everyone. And so I'm going to hand it over to Ankita for the final remark.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the ScienceEye team, I would like to thank today's speakers and all the participants who have joined in the webinar today. And just wanted to give a quick reminder to all of you present here still. As I mentioned earlier, today was the beginning of the webinar series, and we have the next upcoming webinar on October 25th from 10 to 11:30 a.m. EST. And additional information is posted in the website, ScienceEye website, and in the flyers sent to you in your respective emails. So stay tuned, everyone, and please feel free to reach to either of the ScienceEye team members if you have any questions, any doubts. So thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.